you're wondering whether to upgrade some part of your electric guitar, my answer is going to be unequivocally, yes, do it. But first, ask yourself a more important question. What are you hoping to accomplish? The first potential goal that I want to talk about is just having fun. If there's something that you want to do to your electric guitar, swapping out the neck, changing the pickups, just because you think it's going to be fun, that you might enjoy it, just because you have a strong desire to do it, that's like a perfectly good reason to do almost anything. It's such a good reason, in fact, that I don't even think there's really anything to analyze. If you really want to do it, just stop this video and go and do it. Now let's get into the stuff that I hope I can actually help with. Hi, it's Jordan from the future. I'm older and wiser and would like to clarify some things that were a little bit murky in the initial making of this video. The first thing is that I'm not going to touch on upgrades that are really just like bringing your guitar up to code. What I mean is if you have a part in your guitar that's faulty, you should fix that, regardless of whether you think it's going to make some seismic change on another factor of your life as a guitarist. Like, a broken part is a broken part, and you deserve to have an instrument that works. And the things that I discuss later in this video, I'm not going to go into that. I'm going to talk about things that would be like quality of life improvements rather than like bringing you up to a nice baseline. Okay, that's it for now. Back to old me. The first factor that I want to talk about is sound, your tone. You might want to make upgrades to your guitar so that you can achieve some higher or better or different tone from your instrument. In my experience, when people talk about upgrading their guitars, they usually evaluate things in terms of tone, which is funny to me because I don't think that most of the changes you can make to a guitar have a strong effect on tone, but some do. In fact, the effect of some changes is so strong that it makes the other changes seem sort of silly by comparison. And that's what I kind of want to try to explain in this video. And in order to think about that, I think it's best to think about how an electric guitar works. Step one, you do something on the strings of your guitar to create a vibration. That vibration is picked up by a magnetic pickup and turned into an electronic signal that passes through some internal electronics, through the output jack of your guitar, and on into the rest of your rig. That signal chain that actually creates the sound includes a few clues about areas where you might really affect the sound of your guitar, and a couple of red herrings. Let's start by talking about strings. You may not think of a string change as an upgrade to your guitar, but I think you absolutely should, because it's easy to do. There are a ton of different parameters that you can tweak in the strings that you use, and some of those parameters can have a really powerful effect. Unfortunately, some of those parameters also seem to me a little bit like marketing. So, what parameters really matter? I've tried almost every type of string that you can imagine, and to me, the parameters that actually had an effect on the sound of the guitar that I was playing were string gauge and the type of winding that was used. Future Jordan again, I just implied that there are a bunch of string parameters that don't matter that much, and in the moment I feel like calling out what those are. I don't think that what brand you use matters very much. I don't think that really coated versus uncoated has a strong effect on the sound. I don't think the kind of metal alloy that your strings are made of has that much of an effect on the sound. And if you're a vintage enthusiast, round core versus hex core, not a sonic difference from my perspective. At least in all those cases, not a difference compared to what you're going to experience if you change gauge or change winding type. So back to those. Let's talk about gauge first. If you change your gauge from one set, whatever you're using, to a heavier gauge, a thicker set of strings, it's going to give you a slightly bassier sound. If you change from what you have today to a lighter set of strings, conversely, it's going to like reduce a little bit of bass and maybe emphasize the high end. Those are changes that may be exactly what you're looking for. And if it is, great, because it's really inexpensive and easy to change strings. Of course, if you make dramatic changes to the gauge of strings, it can add a lot of tension to the neck of your guitar and create some problems. So, be judicious in the changes that you try, but it's definitely something that I recommend you trying. And the second factor is like winding type, and that, in my mind, runs on a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, there are round wound strings, and on the other side of the spectrum, there are flat wound strings. Whatever you're using today, just know that changing to the other side can have a really dramatic effect on the sound that your guitar produces. I know this because I've been a lifelong round wound player, and after seeing a jazz guitarist I really liked, I asked him, what would you recommend to somebody who was interested in playing jazz? And he said, oh, just go buy some flat wounds and put them on your guitar. This kind of seems like a bullshit story, but it's totally not. I went and saw Grant Green Jr., like the son of the great Grant Green, and after the show, he was very polite, willing to talk to people who came up to him, and he genuinely told me when I asked about playing jazz, just go buy some flat wounds. So I did, and I got way more than I bargained for. It didn't turn me into a great jazz player. I'm a pitiful jazz player, but it did give me a totally different appreciation for the kinds of sounds that my guitar, that this Telecaster, could produce. I don't know if it was jazzier necessarily, and I don't even know that I even liked it, but it was definitely different. It was so different, in fact, that I think it's nice to try just as context for other sonic affecting changes that you might make to your guitar. In a way, everything could be measured against like the difference in tone that you get from going from round wounds to flat wounds. If that's a real change, a noticeable change, a lot of things fall by the wayside. Now, the second thing in the chain that affects sound is your pickup. And I've put, I guess, 2 or 3 different sets of pickups in this guitar, and I've put a set of pickups in an Ibanez that I have. And every time it had a significant effect on the sound of my guitar. So if you have a particular sound in mind, changing pickups is something you could definitely do to pursue that goal at a cost and with a certain amount of difficulty involved. Buying a new set of pickups can be pretty expensive depending on what kind of brand or attributes you're going for, but that's actually getting a little bit better. I've been surprised when I've looked in more recent years at the variety of more budget-friendly pickup options that exist, but when I started playing in the mid-2000s, if you went to a Guitar Center, you were looking at like well over $100, often for just one pickup. So a set of pickups was going to really set you back like the cost of a budget guitar. And that's something that people talk about from time to time. Like, why put a set of nice pickups in a budget guitar? Just go buy a nicer guitar. There are a lot of layers to that question, but the point is that, yeah, the pickups are really expensive. But it still might be something that's worth it to you if you are trying to get a very specific sound out of a very specific guitar. As an example, I mentioned little 59 bridge pickups. You're right, I didn't mention little 59 bridge pickups. This is something that happens when you record like 40 minutes of talking and cut it down to like 15 minutes. Some things sort of disappear, and then you might cross-reference them later. It can get a little bit confusing. That's why you're getting this time travel thing. I put a little 59 in this guitar many years ago when I was like 17 or 18 years old because I wanted the sound of a humbucker guitar. And it did that job pretty well. And one of my good friends loved the sound of that pickup. I just eventually decided that I didn't. And then when I changed the bridge again, I got what I wanted, a significant change in the sound of the bridge pickup of my guitar. Now, the other factor that we need to talk about is difficulty. I'm going to assume that, like me, if you're considering upgrades, you kind of would love to do them yourself. And installing a new set of pickups in an electric guitar is a relatively difficult process. It requires that you have some soldering gear and know a little bit about how to solder. And that's not something that's terribly difficult to learn, but it is a learning curve that's steeper than the curve of trying to, unscrew this screw so that you can put a new strap on your guitar. But it's something that if you're interested and have a little bit of patience and a little bit of time, I have enjoyed learning to solder, and it allows you to do a bunch of other guitar-related things like build pedal kits, and maybe one day I'll build an amp kit. Anyway, it's like a transferable skill, but it is a skill that you'd have to acquire to put pickups in yourself. With those qualifications for cost and difficulty, I think that replacing pickups is one of the better, if not the best way to make a change to the sound that your guitar produces. Now let's move further on in the signal chain to the stuff that's under here, under my bridge plate and this output jack, the internal electronics of your guitars. It's more stuff that you can solder, right? I've spent a lot of time upgrading, switching out, making little changes to the internal electronics in this Telecaster. And I do that mostly for fun, because I actually don't think that those changes have a very significant effect on the sound that your guitar produces. Now, the reason for that is because I typically replace parts with similar parts. So if I've got a 250K potentiometer for my volume pot, I don't buy a 500K, I just get another 250K, and I just get one from a more established or nicer brand. And a 250K pot is a 250K pot. I know there are parts tolerances, but they're not nearly as dramatic as the effect of changing out a pickup, for goodness sake. And the same goes for things like switches and output jacks. I know people have specific brands of output jacks they highly recommend that you get, and they'll even talk about the sonic character of those jacks, and I've never heard that. To me, if you're gonna put time and money into changing the sound of your guitar, where you need to look Pickups and strings. Don't forget about the strings. They're a really good option. I feel some of you judging me for the things that I've just said about internal electronics, so let me try to assuage your concerns. First, let me remind you that when I think upgrade, I don't think replacing a broken part. If you have a pot that doesn't work, if you have a switch that doesn't work, or an output jack that won't hold a cable in, like, do something about that. But the decision to buy CTS pots is very different than the decision to buy a working pot. The second thing I want to point out is that yes, individual parts can be relatively inexpensive, but you're rarely going to go onto a forum and find out that you just need to swap out your pots for CTS pots and everything's going to be fine. Instead, people are going to have a variety of recommendations about the kind of wire that you should use, the kind of output jack that you should use. And if you add all those things together, as I did the first time I changed out my electronics in the pursuit of tone, it's kind of expensive. It probably adds up to $100, and that's a chunk of cash. That's the cost of a pickup. And by comparison to a pickup, these are not going to change your sound in any kind of meaningful way. And that's the point I'm really trying to make, is what effect do these things have relative to one another? I'm not trying to get into the details of every single change that you could possibly make and aggregate those together. I'm trying to think, hey, if you've got a budget, if you're trying to make one decision instead of 10 decisions, what's the decision that you should make? Okay, the second, or I guess third thing that you could want to accomplish from doing an upgrade to your guitar is to change the experience of playing your instrument. This is a factor that doesn't get the attention that it deserves, because so much of the joy that I have found in my life as a guitar player comes from the physical act of playing guitar. There are a lot of modifications that you can make to your guitar that aren't going to have almost any effect on that, but there are a few things you can do that really will. Let's talk first about strings. Changing the gauge of your strings, or the kind of winding that you use on your strings, can have a dramatic effect on the way that they feel, both when your fingertips press on them or pluck on them, and when you bend them or slide around on them. I mean, there's a lot of tactile experience that goes into playing the guitar, and almost all of that happens on your strings. So don't sleep on that. Go try different string types. Experiment, have fun. You may find something that you really, really like. A few of those things that I flagged earlier in the video as not having much of an effect on the sound, well, a couple of those actually do have more of an effect on playing experience, so I want to give them credit where credit's due. Coated versus uncoated is something that I think you can definitely feel, and actually round core versus hex core, I find that round core strings are a little bit easier to bend. That's something that's advertised, and I felt that when I put them on my guitars. But this is another area where I don't think metal alloy is that important, and I certainly don't think brand is that important. The second budget-friendly option that I want to recommend is changing some of these. I'm pointing intentionally to what's on the outside of my guitar. The little knob caps or switch caps that are attached to internal electronics, but they don't really have any effect on what those electronics do. They're just the place where you access whatever those controls are. I have actually had surprising results from making some tweaks to those things. I used the stock Telecaster pot covers that came with this guitar, so nothing to talk about there. But this, you may notice, is not the normal Telecaster switch cover. It's the kind of thing that you would find on a Strat. And I made that replacement because the big black round thing that I had used for years, I just got tired of smacking my hand into it by accident when I was playing with great vigor. And so I thought I'd try something that was a little bit smaller and slimmer. And you know what? It basically made that problem go away. It's easy enough for me to move. That's part of the experience of playing, is tweaking these knobs. And if you have knobs that feel good to you, you're more likely to tweak them, which can, affect tone. I know we already talked about tone, but it's an important part of your playing experience. Those are small, budget-friendly, and relatively easy things that you can do to change your playing experience. Now I want to go to the opposite end of the spectrum and talk about necks. As you know, if you play guitar, a lot of the experience comes from the feel of your neck. There's so much to like or dislike in your neck, both in terms of its shape, its size. Of course, I'm including things like the feel of the fretboard and the height and width of the frets. I mean, there's so many things that you interact with on the neck of your guitar, all of which affect your experience as a guitar player. And there are a few things you can do to affect that, but all of them are quite a bit more drastic than what I've already talked about. If you go and get new frets put into your guitar, or do it yourself, or take some sandpaper to your neck to try to make it smoother, or roughen up a finish that's on there, or remove a finish, those things are kind of permanent. It's pretty easy to undo a change to strings or a change to like the cap that you put on your switch. It's a lot harder to undo like a ton of vigorous sandpaper action on the back of your guitar's neck. So I'd be cautious with that. And that's actually, I've done a lot to this guitar, but that's something that I would probably trust to a professional. But if you have a guitar and you don't like the way that the neck feels in your hand, you know, it's something that you could really consider. The other thing that you could consider if you have a guitar with a bolt-on neck is replacing the neck. And this is the neck that came with this guitar, but for a long time I used a replacement neck on this guitar. In fact, I think in some earlier videos on this channel, I'm playing this guitar, but with that replacement neck. I actually bought a replacement neck in large part because I wanted a sonic change, and I didn't get that. That's why this wasn't included in the change your sound portion of this video. But it did change my experience as a player because it gives you control on the front end over all the options that you might try to modify on the back end. The size of frets, the thickness of the neck, the type of wood that's in the neck and in the fingerboard, and all those things can be really significant. Of course, they also come at a cost, and replacing the neck of a guitar is one of the more expensive things that you can try to do to it. I replaced the neck of this guitar when I was flush with cash for my first real job, but not everybody is going to have that sort of opportunity. And if you do have that opportunity, it's kind of like the thing we talked about in the context of pickups. If you don't like the way that your neck feels, do you really just need a new guitar? My advice is to just be aware that cost is a factor and how it can measure up against a new guitar, and keep that in mind. And keep one other thing in mind too. I'm gonna stop myself there. I go on like a 3-minute tirade to say something that's really fundamentally very simple, and that is some players are gonna like being able to touch a neck before they buy it. Whether that neck is a standalone neck or a neck that's attached to a guitar. If you're one of those types of players, I recommend that you find an option that's at your fingertips. And you may not have access to that many just like freestanding necks. I can think of one store I've ever been to in my life that had just like a couple of bolt-on necks laying around. So if that's something you care about, you might be hesitant to buy a neck online, and I can kind of respect that. The final factor that you may be considering is aesthetics. You may be trying to change the look of your guitar. You may be just trying to put your personal stamp on it or build a different kind of relationship with it. And there are a lot of things that you can do to achieve that goal. And I think it's a really meaningful goal. We spend a lot of time with these instruments. We can begin to think of them as an extension of us. Why not manifest that in some way? Let me tell you about a couple of things that I've done and really enjoyed. First, let's talk about straps. When I started playing, I remember thinking that straps were either really ugly or really expensive, and there was very little in between. But now, you can go to some online retailer and find a wide variety of strap options, colors, designs, thicknesses, comfort, styles, and pick something that really suits you and that you can probably, if you look hard enough, find something that isn't going to destroy your budget. One of the earliest things that I changed in my guitar was to replace the Pickguard. I was also kind of surprised at how expensive those were. Maybe I was buying the wrong brand, but now you can find a variety of them online and get something that looks good to you and make sure it fits like where the holes are in your guitar and all these things. A nice way to kind of add personal touch. Another thing that I've enjoyed, again, we're coming back to these little knobs and switches. You can get some real pleasure out of making small adjustments to the way that those look. This one was a skull for a while, and for a while I just didn't have like a pot cover on this because I thought that was sort of cool. You know, you do you. And the last thing I want to talk about is one of the more significant, that's actually probably the most significant thing that I've ever done to this guitar, and that is that I refinished the body. This used to be sort of like a sunburst or tobacco burst style finish. And I sanded all that off and I tried to stain it. I actually wanted the whole guitar to be sort of this like red color. Obviously it didn't quite turn out that way. But that project is actually maybe the impetus for this entire video. I did this several years ago, and I did it because I had read a bunch of stuff on forums about like what it was gonna do to my tone. And I am here to tell you that it did almost nothing for my tone. It had a small effect on the experience I had playing the guitar because the original finish was like this kind of thicker lacquer, and I didn't like the way it felt when my arm got sweaty, and I sweat a lot, and so that was kind of a nice thing to change. But mostly it ended up being a very time-consuming, relatively expensive project that just affected the aesthetics of my guitar. And if you have the time and the money and the interest and it was a big project, I still would recommend it. it really was like a bonding experience with this guitar. And I had this guitar for many years by then, spent a lot of time playing it with it. I didn't think I could be much more bonded with it, but I am now. I'm bonded. And now every time I look at this guitar, I am inevitably reminded of the experience that I had trying to refinish it. You know, there are all these blemishes all over it, like these dark edges. They're not intentional. They come from, I became impatient with sanding this thing down by hand, and so I bought a sander, not realizing the sander was going to just like tear up the wood grain on my guitar. And so in a few places, it really, really scuffed up the wood, and so when I stained it, it absorbed a lot more stain. Totally an accident. It's like all these edges, you know, where I got lazy and didn't want to use sandpaper to do the job. Every time I look at this guitar, because I did the work on it, I'm reminded of that process and sort of like the foolish mistakes that I made when I was trying to like hustle my way through it, and how much my shoulder hurt, because seriously, sanding is a lot of work. So if your desire is to like build a special kind of bond or really personalize your guitar, that's something that you could consider. And that's it. Those are the upgrades that I recommend you consider if you want to change the tone or playability or aesthetic values of your guitar. There are things that I left out, and if you think that I should have addressed them, please let me know in the comments. I didn't address them because I may have gone into those upgrades thinking they were going to have a significant effect, but ultimately I don't really think they moved the needle. Feel free to debate me, like I said, in the comments. Okay, one more future interjection. I actually had 7 pages of notes like this that I prepared to make this video, and that's the amount of typing that it took for me to talk about all the things that I've done to my guitar over the years. And that's just to say that if you are interested in a specific kind of change, one that I mentioned in this video or one that I didn't, please just like talk about it in the comments. I'd love to give you my opinion. I'm not obviously the last word on anything related to upgrading parts on your guitar, but there are things that I did that I just didn't talk about in this video. So if you want to know more about those, in the comments, hit me up. If you liked this video, please click like and subscribe to my channel. If you want more videos that are kind of like this, I sort of just like play it by ear and do something random every 2 weeks, but you know, I enjoy it and I hope that you do too. And last, if you've done upgrades to your electric guitar or to any instrument that you own that were really meaningful to you for any reason, please tell me about them in the comments. I'd love to hear it, as I'm always sourcing ideas for my next experiment. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I'll see you around.